All right, guys, we are back with The Wild Robot Escapes. Today we're going to be starting on Chapter 20, The Wild Animals. Wildlife can be very good for farmland. Insects pollinate the plants, snakes eat the pests, the droppings of rodents and birds and every other animal act as a natural fertilizer. Roz wanted more of those helpful creatures on the farm, so she let the unused sections of land go wild. Up from the ground emerged native weeds, flowers, and woody brambles, and with the wild plants came wild animals. But then some creatures came skulking around who were not helpful at all. It started when Roz noticed a heavy scent floating on the breeze. She followed the scent out to a narrow strip of forest on the edge of the property. There were clumps of fur in the undergrowth and claw marks in the dirt. There was blood, too, lots of it. And then she found the carcass. A deer had recently been killed and eaten. The robot's head slowly spun around as she scanned the area. Not far from the carcass was a pile of droppings. It looked like it might have come from a dog, but Oscar wasn't large enough or ferocious enough to kill a deer. What kind of animal could have done this? Roz had been standing there at the edge of the property for a while. She imagined Mr. Sharif in his office sitting at his computer, eyeing her location on the map. Any minute now he would hobble out to his truck and come racing down the driveway to check on her. Roz didn't want to upset the man, so she left the carcass where it was and returned to her work. But from then on, she kept a careful watch for any more signs of trouble. Chapter 21, The Howl. It wasn't long before Roz found more signs of trouble. Furry faces poking out from the bushes, musky smells lingering in the fields, silhouettes trotting through the moonlight. And then one night she heard it, the long, menacing howl of a wolf. Chapter 22, The Wolves. The attack happened at dusk. 7 beastly shapes bounded over the fence and into the pasture. Old Annabelle had wandered off from the herd, and now she made an easy target. The herding machine saw the wolves coming and rolled in their direction. But the hunters were clever. They split up, darted past the clunky machine, and surrounded their target. The wolf pack was led by a large male. His name was Shadow, and it was easy to see why. He was quick and quiet and covered in dark fur, except for a long, pale scar that streaked across his body like a comet. Shadow locked eyes with the cow, distracting her with his fierce gaze, and when his pack was in position, he said, "Attack!" The wolves lunged, snapping their jaws at the cow's skinny legs. Annabelle kicked and hollered, "Stay away from me, you brutes!" She was a big animal, but the wolves knew what to do. They kept biting her, kept taunting her, kept wearing her down. The herd watched from afar. They cried out to their friend. They wanted to help, but they were too frightened to move. Well, reader, you can guess who came to the rescue. Footsteps thundered across the pasture, and Roz leaped into the fight. Had she swung her fists or kicked her feet, the wolf pack might have fled. But the robot wasn't programmed to be violent. All she could do was awkwardly defend the cow. Roz felt teeth chomping her arm. She felt claws slashing her chest. Her pain sensors flared and she howled, "Leave us alone!" The robot's booming voice startled the wolves, and in that instant she pried one of them away. Then Annabelle landed a hard kick and another wolf tumbled backward into the grass. More help was coming. The other cows had finally found their courage, and the angry herd was on the march. The wolves had missed their chance. Shadow gave a frustrated grunt, and the pack retreated. They dashed through the pasture, leaped over the fence, and disappeared into the trees. The robot activated her headlights, and shafts of light beamed out of her eyes. While the herd crowded around, Roz carefully examined Annabelle's injuries. "I need to clean and dress these bite wounds," said the robot, "but you will be okay." "Of course I'll be okay," the cow panted. "I'm old, but I'm feisty. Those wolves don't scare me." Annabelle talked tough, but there was no mistaking the fear in her eyes. All the cows were afraid. They knew that if the wolves attacked again, their next victim might not be so fortunate. Chapter 23, The Rifle. The wolves returned the very next morning. Shortly after dawn, they leaped from the trees and started chasing a poor calf through the pasture. Roz managed to drive them off, but that night they returned again. The herd came stampeding into the barn as the wolves laughed and trotted back to the fields. The cows were in shock. They refused to leave the barn. If this continued, the herd would produce less milk, the farm would lose money, and Mr. Sharif would send Roz back to the factory. Something had to be done. Knock, knock, knock. The dog barked and the children opened the door. "How'd you get all those scrapes?" said Jaya. "Is everything okay?" said Jad. "I must speak with your father," said Roz. Mr. Sharif came to the door and Roz explained the problem. At the first mention of wolves, he sent his children to their rooms, but the dog stayed. Oscar had no idea what the man and the robot were discussing, and his tail happily wagged as he stood beside them. However, his tail stopped wagging when Mr. Sharif handed Roz a rifle. The dog had seen the rifle in action, and it frightened him to his core. He scurried into the bushes and hid there, whimpering while the conversation went on. "What do you mean you can't fire a rifle?" the man yelled. "Roz, you're a farmer now, and sometimes farmers have to kill animals." It was the first time Mr. Sharif had ever yelled at Roz. She waited patiently as words and spittle flew from his mouth. "My farm and my family are in danger. Roz, I order you to kill those wolves." "I cannot follow that order because I am not programmed to be violent." Mr. Sharif let out a heavy sigh. He knew Roz was right, but when he reached for the weapon, she wouldn't let go. The man stared at the robot. The robot stared at the dog, and the dog stared at the rifle. Oscar was still whimpering and hiding in the bushes. Just the sight of the rifle had sent him into a panic. It was hard to believe that such a fearful animal was related to wolves. But dogs are related to wolves, though the robot and her computer brain began buzzing with activity. She thought of dogs and wolves and rifles. She thought of Shadow, the wolf leader, and the long straight scar on his side, and then she had an idea. "Although I cannot fire the rifle," said Roz, "I believe it can help me solve the wolf problem." Mr. Sharif frowned. He didn't know what the robot was getting at, but he was happy to let her handle the wolves by herself. "Fine, try it your way. Just don't lose any cows or else we might have to lose a robot too." Chapter 24, The Bluff. The cows peered out from the barn at Roz. The robot was holding the rifle. She carried it to the far side of the pasture and placed it by her feet. Then she began coating herself with mud and grass and probably a little cow dung. When every inch of her body was concealed, she nestled down into the ground and became part of the landscape, an ordinary clump of grass. The cows were stunned. "What's Roz doing? Is she all right? Where did she go?" Roz had learned to camouflage herself back on the island, and now she was using that trick once again. She sat motionless for hours, waiting for the wolves to appear. Daylight faded, the stars came out, the moon climbed into the sky, but the wolves didn't show, so Roz tried something new. The robot was an excellent mimic, and she began crying out in the sad voice of a wounded calf. "Please help me," she cried. "I have hurt my leg and I cannot move." Crickets chirped. "Please help me." An owl hooted. "I cannot move." The calf's voice continued crying out. Finally, as the moon dipped behind the trees, 7 wolves slunk into the pasture. Shadow led the way, silently stalking through the night. Covered in dark fur, he was practically invisible. Only his long, pale scar gave him away. Noses sniffed, eyes searched, ears listened. Then a clump of grass began rustling. "There," whispered Shadow. "The calf is hiding in that tall grass." "Something feels wrong to me, Shadow," said a female wolf. "This is too easy." "I make the decisions, Barb," snapped the wolf leader. "Slash, lurk, fang, circle around, and wait for my signal." 3 wolves dashed off, and when they were in position, Shadow gave the signal, and his pack closed in on the wounded calf. With each step, the grass rustled more and more until the ground seemed to be moving, and then the ground really was moving. Grass and dirt crumbled aside, and there was the robot standing tall, pointing the rifle at the wolf leader. The pack froze. "Hello, Shadow," growled the robot. "My name is Roz. I see from your scar that you are familiar with rifles. You have been shot at before. You know what will happen if I pull this trigger. Reader, you and I are well aware that our robot was not programmed to be violent. Roz couldn't have pulled that trigger even if she wanted to. She didn't want to. She was bluffing. Of course, Shadow didn't know any of this. As far as the wolf knew, he was defeated. And so he did what wolves do when they are defeated. He lay down and he cowered before the robot. For the first time anyone could recall, the wolf leader looked weak. I do not want to hurt any wolves, Roz continued, but if you return to this farm, I will have no choice. Now please leave and never come back. Shadow scrambled away with his tail between his legs. Barb was close behind him, followed by the other wolves, and soon the entire pack had disappeared into the night. Chapter 25, The Summer. Spring melted into summer, and the wolves were nowhere to be seen. Perhaps Roz had scared the pack off for good. Or perhaps the heat was keeping them away. You see, it was the hottest time of year on the farm. The sun was scorching, the fields were baking, the pond was drying up, and foul odors were floating all throughout the dairy. During dry spells, the farm's powerful sprayers were activated. Water shot out in long, misty arcs, and the land turned deeper shades of green. When the hayfields were lush and ready to be harvested, Roz fired up the mower and the baler. The giant machines rolled out of the shed and down the long driveway. Shortly afterward, they rolled back in, leaving bales of hay strewn across the stubbly fields. The cows and the humans spent hot days indoors. Only when the sun set and the air began to cool would they venture outside. The herd strolled out to graze under the stars. The children ran out to chase fireflies. And sometimes even Mr. Sharif stepped out to stretch his stiff legs. Trees swished in the evening breeze. Heat lightning flickered on the horizon. Cicadas sang their summer songs. When Roz wasn't farming, she was searching for a way to escape. Everything hinged on the children. The robot needed their help, but she just couldn't bring herself to tell them the truth. It was too risky. Mr. Sharif asked the children not to distract Roz from her work, but they did it anyway. They'd sneak out of the house and order the robot to play with them. Together they told stories, rode bicycles, lay in the grass watching fluffy clouds drift by. Summer was tornado season. On occasion, thick clouds would start funneling downward, reaching for the ground. So far, the funnel clouds had all receded back into the sky before doing any damage. But it was only a matter of time before a tornado touched down. Chapter 26, The Tornado. The weather forecasts warned of possible tornadoes that day, but despite their scientific equipment, experts still could not predict exactly when or where a tornado would strike. So most farmers carried on with their usual tasks while keeping a watchful eye on the skies. Roz was out in the fields loading hay bales onto the flatbed truck as towering puffy clouds rose up from the south. Raindrops lightly tapped against her body, and she thought nothing of it. The wind began to blow, and still the robot continued with her work. It wasn't until the first flash of lightning that Roz finally called it quits. She climbed into the back of the truck, and it automatically rolled across the hayfield toward the driveway. The storm developed quickly. Dark clouds started swirling and bulging downward, lower and lower, like a giant twisting finger pointing at the countryside. A tornado was beginning to form. When the truck reached the driveway, Roz hollered, "Drive faster!" The engine revved, the tires kicked up gravel, and the robot held on tight. The funnel cloud continued stretching downward. It brushed the tree line, and leaves exploded into the air. Dust whirled around and around, rising higher with each spin. Then the tornado touched the ground. The siren sounded in the distance, but the tornado was growing noisier and angrier as it blew in from the fields, and the siren was quickly lost to the howling winds. The truck charged up the driveway and into the cluster of farm buildings. Roz looked ahead at the house and saw frightened faces in the windows. "Go to the storm shelter," she hollered in her loudest voice. Then she leapt off the truck and ran to help the Sharifs. Leaves and sticks flew sideways, whipping against the robot's body, knocking her off balance. Behind her, the farm buildings rattled and groaned. The milking parlor was shaking violently. With a long, terrible screech, its entire roof peeled off and sailed away on the wind. 4 blurry shapes appeared in the backyard. Mr. Sharif shielded his face and hobbled alongside the house toward the storm shelter. He threw open the door and waved everyone downstairs. Oscar went first, then Jaya, but Jad wasn't moving. "Come on, Jad," yelled his father. The boy stood still, shaggy hair flying everywhere, and stared up at the towering, twisting tornado. He used to have nightmares about tornadoes, but this was no nightmare. It was real, and it was getting closer. Clouds swirled faster, the wind roared louder, the trees bent down to the ground. Jad suddenly felt strong arms around him, and Roz whisked him to safety. Mr. Sharif reached up from inside the shelter, desperately grasping for his son, and just when Roz thrust the boy into his father's arms, a blast of wind slammed the shelter door closed and swept our robot away. At first, Roz didn't realize she was in the tornado. She kept expecting to fall back to the ground, but the wind only lifted her higher and higher. She saw the treetops, the rooftops, the faraway fields. More of the countryside came into view with each spin around the funnel cloud. Our robot's survival instincts were blaring in her head, urging her to protect herself. But what could she do? The tornado was in control. The winds whirled her up and down and around and around. Roz could almost imagine what it was like to fly, and she thought of Brightbill. It seemed her final moments would be spent in her son's airborne world. Roz wasn't the only thing swept away in the storm. Dust, gravel, leaves, branches, fence posts, and farm equipment were all swirling around her. The robot was pelted by flying objects, big and small. She never even saw the shovel coming. The heavy tool wheeled around the tornado, and clang! It hit the back of her head, and everything suddenly went dark, while Roz was still up in the sky. Chapter 27. The Broken Robot. The Sharifs found their robot powered off, lying in a ditch by the road. Her left leg was crumpled beneath her torso. Her right arm was twisted around a tree trunk, and her whole body was covered in new scrapes and dents. Together, the family heaved Roz into the bed of the pickup truck where Oscar was waiting. The dog sniffed her broken body while the Sharifs climbed in beside him. Then Rambler turned around. The road was littered with debris from the storm, and the truck had to drive slowly. As they bounced along, Jad pressed the button on the back of Roz's head. She powered up, and her garbled voice automatically said, "Hello, I am Rozum, Unit 7134, but you may call me Roz." Oscar licked the poor robot's face, and Jad leaned in close. "Roz, can you hear me? Are you okay?" "Hello, Jad. I have broken limbs and minor damage to my computer brain. My systems are now repairing themselves. Please stand by." The robot's glowing eyes pulsed as her recovery program did its job, and before long, Roz sounded like her old self. "My computer brain is now fully functional." Jad wrapped his arms around the robot and sobbed. "I'm so sorry, Roz. It's my fault the tornado got you. Please don't be mad." Now Jaya was crying too. She pulled her brother and her dog and her robot into a big hug. Mr. Sharif wasn't much of a hugger, but he reached over and laid his hand on Roz's shoulder. They stayed like that for some time, quietly holding one another. The shock of the tornado was fresh, and it felt good to be together. "Mr. Sharif, I apologize for leaving the farm without your permission," said the robot. The man smiled. "No need to apologize, Roz. I'm just glad you're alive." "How are the cows?" said Roz. "The farm is a mess, but the cows are fine," said Mr. Sharif. "We'll take you to the repair shop right now, and you'll be with the herd again soon."